Good morning, everyone. My name is Asima Nabi, and I am one of the students in Masters in Education, Special Educational Need in Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland. My topic is about correlation between poverty and difficulties with learning. In this presentation, I will be talking about poverty. What is poverty and how it forms a vicious cycle? Poverty means a state of being inferior in quality and quantity, which includes lack of education, lack of opportunity, low income, and poor health living conditions. The question now arises here, how can we break down this cycle? The answer is simple, by providing them education. According to UNESCO, the most important single factor in breaking down the poverty cycle is by giving them better education. Now we have talked about a key word, that is education, but let's ask ourselves, are we really going to do it by being fair enough with all? I'm not talking about equality, I'm talking about equity. As you can see the picture, which truly indicates the fairism, whether it's a kid with special need or a kid without special need. Everyone is enjoying. The other picture also depicts how the poorest families are 8 times less likely to be enrolled in primary school as the richest. This podcast was published in December 3, 2020 last year, where the two professors were discussing on the topic, that is correlation between poverty and difficulties with learning and gaining access to learning. In this podcast, Dr. Joanna Banks is interviewing Professor Richard Rose about his experience while working on inclusion education. The research conducted by Richard Rose, who is a professor in inclusive education at the University of Northampton, UK, shares his experiences while working on inclusion education in different socio-economic and cultural backgrounds. He discusses how models of inclusion in the Western world can be understood and transferred in different cultures with respect to socio-economic background. He talks about equitable approach to inclusion in a way that is welcomed by people from different cultural backgrounds. Professor Richard shares his piece of work in this podcast, which he has been doing for the last 20 years on inclusion education in Asian and African countries. He has interviewed a few teachers and students from India and Cambodia and realized that poverty in Asia and African countries is the biggest factor that stops poor people to access the resources needed for learning. He also talks about labeling children with learning difficulties and how it is still an issue. What are the key elements which needs to be focused on? Number 1, inclusion education and inclusion models. What is it all about? Inclusive education means real learning opportunity for groups who have been excluded, for example, people with disabilities, people from poor socio-economic background. While as inclusive models include providing learning resources, educational activities, materials, it refers to a model where students with disabilities spend time with ordinary students in classroom. Number 2, learning disabilities, for example, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and so on. In Western countries, children with attention and hyperactivity issue have to go through proper psychological assessment and then get proper support as per requirement. But it is totally different among poor communities in Asia and Africa because of lack of resources. Developmental disability, for example, autism. Children with autism needs much more support, but children who have poor background cannot get the support. Socioeconomic status background. Due to poverty and cultural differences, children with disability lack proper support. Cultural differences. In India and African countries, people still are not aware of certain advanced approach towards inclusion education. Due to lack of literature, students, researchers in developing nations use Western literature. Equity in education. Equity means offering support to students that addresses possible barriers like poverty or limited resources, but still researchers are struggling to tackle with inclusion education model approach in Asia and Africa. Now let's come to the chart. We can see the ratio between the girls and the boys. In this chart, we can see the ratio among boys and girls along with age group of 0 to 19 years of age across India, which UNESCO Census 2011 has provided us. We can see only 47% of girls below the age of 5 years attend special school and rest didn't attend. While as 53% ratio of boys below age of 5 years attend special school. This shows that girls are lacking behind in providing support. We can also see that among children with disabilities, 72% resides in rural areas or attending special schools because of the availability of proper sport, while as 28% residing in urban areas are far behind in attending special school because of lack of sport. Now coming to the chart of school attendance. Here, this chart also shows us that the school attendance of children with disabilities. It means only 61% of children with disabilities have attended educational institutes, 12% have attended earlier, and remaining 27% has never attended. It's really very sad. Now, what was the main aim of this podcast? Professor Richard's main aim was how the Western model on inclusion education can be very much challenging when applied to different parts of the world. Poverty and a lack of proper resources in Asian and African countries can affect the poor people to access the resources they need for learning. Let's see certain barriers which children with disabilities can face. There are so many. For example, language discrimination. In this podcast, Professor Richard is talking about labeling. He talks about how children with disabilities are labeled with diagnoses like ADHD, autism, and which are assessed by professional institutions. Unfortunately, due to poverty, children with disabilities are struggling despite having developmental learning needs. Number 2, correlation. If you live in poverty, you are more likely to have children with disabilities. And also, if you have children with disabilities, you are more likely to go into poverty. Number 3, inclusion education models. As an educator, we should think beyond an inclusion model like social economic issues surrounding children with disabilities. Last, cultural background. In this podcast, Professor Richard talks about equity, that children with disabilities should get proper assistance according to inclusion education models. For example, there could be mainstream schools and special schools. But unfortunately, due to certain cultural differences and lack of resources, children with disabilities are not getting proper support. In Ireland, Professor Richard talks about how Ireland is doing well in inclusion education models as compared to other Western nations under several projects funded by the Department of Education. He argues that labeling or discrimination is still an issue in Ireland, and this is an attitude that we teach us how to change. This podcast is very interesting. It explains to us how an educator, researcher can work on inclusion education models in different cultures. It opens us a vision of how we should think beyond inclusion models when helping children with disabilities. We should provide proper training to teachers and improve the infrastructure among poor people. We should educate people in rural areas about resources available in the community for children with disabilities. I learned a lot from this podcast. It will help me to research more into this topic in the future. Thank you.